Let's discuss how new soil is formed. We've already mentioned parent material and the process of weathering, and we've talked about how water, air, and organic matter also is an essential component to soil. But how about the rate? How can we measure how fast the soil forms? And if we go to different parts of the world, how will we know whether soil building will be quick or slow? And if we look at parent material, how do we decide where it came from and how that may have an impact on growing plants? The presentation today is going to be based off of material that's standard in soil science. And in particular, with this presentation, I borrowed a few tips from the Soil Science Society of America and the National Earth Science Teachers Association. So here we go with our presentation on soil formation. It's important to remember that in general, soil forms from the surface downward. So if you're looking through a profile and looking at the various horizons, in general, the new stuff should be on the top. If we keep that in the back of our minds, then it's always easy to kind of reference, okay, where are we in geologic history? What's the new stuff? What's the old stuff? Soil forms from the surface downward. And so usually the new stuff is up top. There are four primary pathways with which the soil arrives to its present location. And we categorize them in four distinct categories or terminologies. We say there are additions, there are losses, there are translocations, and there are transformations. And this is a simplified understanding of a very dynamic process. So while we can categorize actions into one of four terms, you have to remember that in nature, all of these are interacting all the time, and they may go through multiple stages over geologic time, which is such a long time, it can be difficult to wrap our heads around. Some of these actions may fit into more than one category, and at any given time, all of these processes are taking place. Soil is dynamic, and so it's in a constant state of change. The additions of soil come from the rain. As well, we get flooding. Floodwaters will leave behind sediment. You can have dumping, so that would be an anthropogenic source. So trash, if humans deposit material, and we do have human deposits going back into the geologic history as well. We don't condone this activity, but think about a landfill. A landfill is certainly a large mound filled with soil and other things. And in the future, if somebody came and dug in the landfill, they would have some questions, certainly. There's deposition, which is any sediment that's left behind by wind, water, glaciers, and other sorts of natural processes. We also have landslides, where every once in a while a mountain will have a dramatic change where gravity pulls down all the material from the cliff face, and organic matter can accumulate on the surface of the soil and over time add organics in the soil as well. The losses, those come in the form of leaching, where we lose minerals from water passing through the soil as it goes down to the groundwater. We have erosion, which can be from wind, water, or ice. Again, landslides, they take the soil from one place and move it to another. And flooding, similarly, we have losses as well as additions. Translocations have to do with underground movement. So mainly this is from animals digging, everything from ants all the way to Gophers, ground squirrels, rabbits, they all dig holes and they physically bring material from the ground to the surface. And humans do the same thing, you could say, with mining and agriculture and construction as well. And then there's also salt, which can build up over time in the soil if you have excessive evaporation, as we tend to have in the West. If you don't manage your irrigation and your evaporation by using shade and mulch, then over time you have soil evaporation, which leaves behind salts, and over time that can accumulate. So all of those are considered translocations. And then finally, we have transformations. And that would include processes like decomposition of organic matter down into humus. And as our plants take up minerals, we are actually removing those minerals from the soil. And that's happening, as we know, with ionic compounds that dissolve into water. And so that's also considered transformation of the soil. When we look at the rate of soil formation, there are 5 primary categories, and soil formation is a function of all of these 5 variables. Each of these 5 categories has an impact on the rate of soil formation. Soil scientists use the mnemonic device of CLORPT. Not that that means anything to me, but CLORPT, CLORPT, helps you to remember the 5 different elements. So that's the climate, organisms, relief or topography, parent material, and of course, time. So if you alter any of these 5 variables, you will change the rate of soil formation. So let's take a look at climate and how does climate have an impact on soil formation. There's 2 main variables in climate that really play the biggest role, and that is temperature and precipitation. In fact, you can classify most ecosystems and habitat types based on their relative amounts of temperature and precipitation. Temperature has an impact on the rate of evapotranspiration, as well as the rate of plant growth, the amount of biological activity, and chemical reactions themselves will be increased at an increased rate of temperature. In fact, a 10 degrees Celsius rise in average temperature tends to lead to a doubling or tripling of chemical reactions in the soil. That's a natural ecological law called the Q10 rule. You find that as you increase temperature every 10 degrees, all sorts of biological and chemical processes expand. Temperature as well will have an impact on the freeze-thaw cycles, which certainly will have an impact on the amount of weathering that takes place. Precipitation similarly affects plant growth and biological activity, of course, but additionally, the rainfall, the snowfall affects how materials dissolve and also has an impact on transformation and translocation, chemical reactions, and leaching of minerals. And finally, we know that extra rain will cause extra erosion. So if we look at these 2 variables of temperature and precipitation and we map them out, we can see that different ecosystems and habitat types will cater to different soils and different rates of soil formation. So here's a chart that shows average annual temperature on the x-axis and annual precipitation on the y-axis. It's in metric units. Notice that if you go all the way to the extremes in temperature and precipitation, you're in the tropical rainforest. And if you are all the way in the low temperatures and the low precipitation, you're in the polar tundra, the Arctic regions. If you stay dry but go up in temperature, you will get to subtropical deserts. And if you stay on the dry side but go up in precipitation, you ride this curvy line, and that takes you from tundra to a boreal forest temperate rainforest, and then down into tropical rainforests. And where would San Diego be? Well, to find out, you could take a look at our data, our annual average temperatures and precipitation, but you can also look here on this graph and see what is our typical habitat type. And for the most part, we are chaparral, which is a woodland shrubland habitat. So we're in that browned category, kind of in the middle on the temperature range, but on the dry side. Another way to express this is with the pyramid diagram on the right-hand side. You can see with a pyramid, we've got three variables, and increasing dryness is one of those variables. Increasing temperature is the other variable. And then the third one is actually latitude, which is not necessarily written, but you can see with these different regions, Arctic, subarctic, temperate, and tropical. At all of those different latitudes, there's different evapotranspiration rates, and therefore you'll have different habitat types that develop. And you can see pretty much all the same habitat types as on each of these graphs, and you can understand that they are a result of temperature, precipitation, and geography. If we take a look at our organisms and how they have an impact on soil formation, well, there's three main types of organisms. There's plants, animals, and the microorganisms. Plants certainly will be pulling in soluble nutrients, and then if they are left alone, they will be dying, decaying, decomposing, and adding organic matter to the soil. Animals will be burrowing through the soil, like our ground squirrel there. And also we have animals that graze and browse and eat plants, and then they deposit the byproduct somewhere else. And then finally, the microorganisms and the invertebrates include bacteria, fungi, and all sorts of things that you can and cannot see down in the soil. And they all participate in one form or another in the formation of soil and the movement of soil, the accumulation, the transportation of soil. A few specific examples: if a tree falls in the woods, when the roots emerge out of the ground, that soil is literally picked up and pulled away from where it was and will be transported somewhere else over time. So that's something large, all the way down to something small. The ants themselves form ant hills. Termites will form termite mounds. And these are things that are built by animals. So ants, rabbits, as they burrow through the soil, will have an impact. Coyotes, you can notice the very characteristic scratching and digging of a dog, canine type animal. And even aquatic animals as well can have an impact on soil formation. And so there's an image there showing crayfish burrows and how they even transport different soil types within a soil profile because of their daily processes, their behavior. So organisms play a key role in the rate of soil formation and what exactly happens. Another name for relief is topography. What we're talking about is the actual shape of the land. And so the degree of slope, the steepness of the hills will have an impact on erosion and stability. If something's very steep, you can expect it to be eroding more quickly as wind and rain has an impact on it. If something's a little bit more shallow, then maybe the rate would be a little bit slower. Similarly, the soils at the top of mountains are often very thin, while the soils in the valleys are typically very thick. Over time, there's accumulation at the bottom and there's losses from the top. So how steep the land is and where you are on that slope has an impact on the rate of erosion, the stability of the land, and how water relates, the amount of infiltration versus the amount of runoff. So here is a gentle slope, and at the bottom we have terms that help to describe the different sections of a slope. So if any kind of hill, mountain, or even a gentle up or down, we've got these terms. And at each of these 5 points, there will be different things happening down at the soil level as far as formation goes. So at the very top, we have the summit. And then as that starts to move downward, it's called the shoulder. Right in the middle is called the side or the back slope. And then you get down toward the bottom where it starts to change shape and it's the foot slope. And then at the very bottom, it's called the toe slope. So usually it starts out relatively flat. And as the hill goes down, it's convex in shape. Then you reach a point where it starts to turn and go concave in shape. So that turning point is right around the side slope. The foot slope tends to be concave and the toe slope can be almost flat. And so at each of these different points on the hill, we will have different effects, different rates of losses and accumulations, different rates of weathering and erosion in our soil, and different amounts of infiltration as well. Now, if we look at the parent material, there's many things to consider. We know that weathering of parent material forms the mineral component of our soil. And yet, how did that parent material get there? Well, it can be from the rock below, so it could have just kind of always been there. We call that residual material. It could have been brought in with organic matter. This is not necessarily the organic component of soil we're talking about in this case. This is more like ancient organic deposition. So either it was in the oceans or on land. And then it can be transported as well. So let's take a look at how this works. And so I'm going to just diagram here all of the different processes just to help illustrate how they tend to work. And we can think about it with starting with rock. That rock breaks down over time in place. It stays where it was. And as it breaks down with wind and rain, temperatures freezing and thawing, eventually we have parent material right where it came from. And that's called the residual parent material. That parent material becomes sediment. And now that sediment can start to move around. So rocks turn into sediment. In the sediment, we can now start to grow plants. So those plants will all of a sudden start contributing to organic parent material. And remember, we're not talking about the humus and the worms and the bugs at this point. We're talking about long-term ancient buildup of carbon compounds. And so the plants start contributing to organic parent materials, which also add to the sediment loads. Now, this sediment can be transported in various ways. One of the ways it's transported is with water. And if it's transported in water and ends up in lakes, then we call that material, the sediment that forms in a lake, we call that lacustrine. If the water is transporting sediment and depositing it in a stream, we call that alluvial or fluvial parent material. And any sediment that's transported by water and settles in the oceans is called a marine parent material. Now, gravity also can transport our sediment, and when it is deposited by gravity in the form of a landslide or just general rolling downhill, we call that colluvial. And if it's transported by ice, usually it's in the form of glaciers. So right now, glaciers are receding because the temperature is warming on the planet. But we know that there's been many periods of cooling and warming, and when it's cooling, the glaciers grow. As the glaciers grow, they actually scrape soil and sediment, and we call that type of deposited parent material glacial till. The Sierra Nevadas, Yosemite Valley is one of the most famous glacially carved valleys. So a lot of the sediment that's deposited there can be considered to be glacial till. As the glaciers recede, they melt. And when the water is coming off of the glaciers, we still count that as part of the ice transported as opposed to the water transported. And so then that would be called glacial outwash. And then we have wind transported sediment. And when it's deposited by the wind, it's called aeolian. And there's a couple different ways to spell it. So here's a general diagram of how soil can be moved around, and geologists will use different terms to try to classify and say, where did it come from? When did it come from? And what sorts of forms will it take? Now, the interesting thing is it's not just a one-time process. This can happen over and over again. So anything that was once transported can be transported again. And oftentimes, if it was transported by water or by gravity, and then the climate changes and now there's no longer a giant river in that place, then if it's been left to be exposed as soil and dry out, then we expect the wind over time to continue to have an impact on these transported materials. And then it ends up blowing them around even further. So to just show it with some photos, the residual material is weathered and formed in place. It literally just stays there. It's broken down rocks. The organic parent material is the accumulation of plant and animal debris over a long period of time. And this generally happens in very wet environments, things like marshes and bogs. And then our transported materials are materials that have moved and then weathered, and they can be moved by a variety of different mechanisms. And here's a diagram showing some of them. We've got the glaciers, the oceans, the lakes, streams, volcanoes with wind, and gravity. Here are some images that illustrate some of the terminology we discussed. We've got marine transported sediments, that's the beach sand. The lacustrine is sediments deposited by lakes. Fluvial sediments are those deposited by streams. And then we've got ice transported. There's an image of a glacier up top. And you can imagine that as that glacier is pushing over the top of the ground, it is picking up all the rocks. It's scraping the soil and the mountains. And what it leaves behind is called glacial till. As that glacier recedes and melts away, we're left with something called glacial outwash. And when we look at wind, in general, we call the deposition by wind loess. It has a typical name of loess, oftentimes found in semi-arid areas. And so you can see wind transporting soil. The top image is Africa. It's the Sahara. And that is all dust from the Sahara being blown westward over to the Americas. And actually, the dust from the Sahara Desert goes down and provides very valuable nutrients, not just for the Atlantic Ocean, but for the tropical rainforests in the American tropics. And then, of course, in the Great Plains, we have the history of the Dust Bowl and how dust can tend to pick up and blow soil particles and sediments in periods of drought. So dust storms are a mechanism by which soil is transported and deposited. We call that loess. And then finally, there's the factor of time. So we know that if you wait a long time, you will have much more soil formation. And if you wait a short amount of time, you will have less soil formation. How do these different factors impact the rate or the time it takes for soil to form? Well, in general, if you're really hot and really dry, like a desert biome, then that's going to be slow. If you're really cold and really dry, like Antarctica, that's also going to be slow. In both cases, it's dry, and so it'll be limiting to physical weathering. And the hot and cold temperatures can also be limiting to biological activity. If you are hot and wet, like in the tropics, that's fast because you have a lot of rain, so a lot of weathering, and you also have a lot of temperature, which speeds up all of the processes. And then if you go to cold and wet, like in the boreal forests, northern Canada and Russia, that's also going to be slow because cold temperatures. So when you look at a soil profile, you can determine the age based on the development of these different horizons. It takes time for these horizons to form. So if you look at a soil and you see relatively few horizons, you can determine that this is a younger soil. It has been formed more recently. So perhaps it was transported very recently and hasn't had time for it to stratify and settle out. Or perhaps everything you see is just the result of a single event. And so that would be a younger soil. It happened more recently. However, if you look at a soil profile and you see lots of variation, lots of different type of horizons, then that's an indication that it's been there for a long time because it's had time for more things to happen and things have accumulated. Some of them take place over a long period of time, very gradually, and other things may happen quite suddenly, but still they're infrequent enough that it takes many, many years for all the different horizons to form. And finally, we see here just a diagram showing about how long does it take? Well, Ka stands for thousands of years. So at day one, your parent material, just plain rock. It's no soil development. Now, after 5,000 years, we see some of that parent material has broken down. And so we've got organic matter in an A horizon, but there's still minimal development. And this is what we would call a young soil. A mature soil will have a very distinct A and B horizon. And so the A will have an accumulation of organic matter. That's, of course, our top soil. And this is actually our most productive soil for growing plants because it's old enough to have enough substrate and material, but it's not so old that it's been weathered and leached of all of its minerals yet. So it's kind of like in its prime. 10,000-year-old soil's the best. If we get up to 20,000 years old, then notice we have some other horizons that form, and we'll have an increased clay content, and the pH will change over time, and our organic matter, therefore, will also tend to decline. And then as we get into an old soil, it's virtually 100% weathered. There's not much parent material left, 50,000-year-old and older soil. Notice how the A horizon is smaller. It's been eroded away and weathered, and our B horizon increases. And we tend to have just a soil that is leached of most of its soluble minerals and not as good for growing plants. And it's ready for a volcano or a landslide or an earthquake to come along and rejuvenate the old soil. So this is a process that takes a long, long time. It's longer than a human time scale because our life will come and go many generations, and the soil won't really show much of a change. But these changes could potentially happen suddenly, and it's important to understand the time scales we're talking about when we talk about soil formation, because we don't want to come along and just dump a bunch of soil in the ocean. It took 10, 20, 50,000 years for it to get that way. And so we recognize that it's not something we can just easily get back in our lifetime, at least. So there's just a little introduction to the factors that have an influence on soil development and formation. Each location on Earth has a different rate of soil building. In all cases, it's a long time. It's longer than a meaningful human timescale. So, in this regards, we consider soil to be a non-renewable resource because you could get rid of it and it won't form again in your lifetime or anyone you know's lifetime. So wherever the soil is, we want to protect it. We can enhance it with water, air, and organic matter, but we don't want to just straight up remove it and get rid of it altogether unless we absolutely have to, because otherwise we've done something that's irreversible. And if we can enhance our understanding of these variables and how they take place, you can arrive to any place on Earth. You can understand temperature, precipitation. You can take a look at the biome, the habitat type, and you can have some clues about what type of soil you may expect to find, as well as when in time are you? Is this a young soil? Is this a very, very old soil? Or are we in that sweet spot, a mature soil that is going to be perfect for growing plants? Thanks a lot.